was actually very, very tough because we lost him as a director. They didn't replace him for a whole month. So it was really dramatic to have a guy who didn't quite really get the story.
Most people think they know the story of Tombstone. The gunfights, the glory, the legendary one-liners that still echo through popular culture more than 30 years later. But what if the version you watched in theaters was almost never finished? What if the man credited with directing it barely touched the camera? What if the most iconic performance in the entire film came from an actor who was literally falling apart on set? The truth behind Tombstone is wilder, stranger, and far more dramatic than anything that made it onto the screen. Stay with us, because the real story starts right now. Before a single frame of Tombstone was ever shot, the screenplay itself was fighting for its life. Writer Kevin Jarre had poured extraordinary effort into crafting something that felt genuinely different from the standard Western formula Hollywood kept recycling. His script was dense, historically detailed, and populated with morally complicated characters who felt pulled directly from the dusty streets of 1880s Arizona. It was ambitious in the truest sense of the word. The problem was that ambition made studio executives deeply uncomfortable. Hollywood in the early 90s was not exactly welcoming to serious, dialogue-heavy westerns with large ensemble casts and a 3-hour runtime. Most executives who read the script passed on it quickly, some without finishing it. A few were more direct in their dismissal, warning that westerns were commercial poison and that this particular western was too long, too crowded, and too risky to be worth anyone's money. Jarre refused to accept those verdicts. He kept rewriting, kept knocking on doors, and kept believing in the story he had built. Eventually, independent financiers stepped in where major studios would not, and the production moved forward on the strength of sheer determination rather than institutional support. Even after funding was secured, Tombstone's troubles were only beginning. Kevin Jarre, the man who had written the script with such passion and precision, was also handed the director's chair, a decision that would prove catastrophic almost immediately. Directing a major motion picture is an entirely different discipline from writing one, and the gap between those two skills became painfully obvious within the first weeks of filming. Scenes fell behind schedule at an alarming rate. Communication between departments broke down. The cast found themselves waiting through long, unproductive days without clear guidance, while the crew scrambled to maintain any semblance of momentum. Costs climbed rapidly, and the studio's patience evaporated even faster. Within weeks, the decision was made to remove Jarre from the director's chair entirely, leaving the production in a state of genuine crisis. Nobody was certain the film could survive the transition. Nobody was certain there was even a film left worth saving. What happened next has become one of the most fascinating open secrets in modern Hollywood history. George P. Cosmatos was brought in as the replacement director, and his name appears in the credits to this day. But numerous people who were present during filming have spoken over the years about what was actually happening behind the scenes. Kurt Russell, who was already committed to the project as Wyatt Earp, effectively stepped into the vacuum of leadership and began steering the production himself. He worked directly with producers, reviewed footage each evening, helped restructure the shooting schedule, and made critical decisions about which scenes would serve the story and which needed to be cut or reworked. Russell was not credited for any of this. He sought no public recognition and rarely discussed the extent of his involvement in interviews. Yet the people around him consistently described his presence as the single most stabilizing force on a production that had been dangerously close to complete collapse. Cosmatos served as the functional director on set, but the creative vision guiding Tombstone through its most difficult weeks belonged largely to its lead actor. Ironically, the man who would quietly save the production had not even been the studio's preferred choice to play its central character. When it came to casting Wyatt Earp, studio executives had genuine reservations about Russell. Their concerns were oddly specific, touching on everything from his physical appearance to the quality of his voice, and even fixating on something as seemingly minor as whether his mustache looked right for the period. There was a feeling in some corners of the production that Russell lacked the gravitas or the visual authority the role demanded. Russell pushed back against all of it. He did not simply accept the skepticism and move on. He argued for himself, demonstrated his understanding of the character, and refused to be edged out of a role he believed he was right for. That persistence proved decisive. Looking back now at the finished performance, it is almost impossible to imagine any version of Tombstone built around a different Wyatt Earp. Russell brought a quiet ferocity to the character that no amount of physical casting criteria could have manufactured. While Russell was fighting for his role, a very different actor was being seriously considered for the part that would ultimately define the entire film. Before Val Kilmer's name rose to the top of the list, Willem Dafoe was apparently a genuine contender for Doc Holliday. On paper, the fit made a certain kind of sense. Dafoe possessed the kind of coiled, unpredictable intensity that the role required, and his reputation for disappearing completely into difficult characters had already been well established. But studio anxiety intervened once again. Dafoe's recent work, including films that had generated significant controversy, made executives nervous about the kind of attention his involvement might attract. A production already plagued by financial and logistical problems did not need additional controversy stirred up by casting choices. The offer never materialized, and eventually Kilmer stepped into the role that would become the defining performance of his career. The difference between those two versions of Doc Holliday is impossible to calculate, but it is safe to say the film audiences fell in love with would have been a fundamentally different experience. Whatever doubts anyone might have had about the casting eventually dissolved the moment Kilmer arrived on set and refused to leave the character behind. His commitment to Doc Holliday extended far beyond the hours when cameras were rolling. He adopted the character's physical deterioration, incorporating the weakened posture, the shallow breathing, and the distant gaze of a man being slowly consumed by tuberculosis. He maintained Doc's speech patterns and kept himself emotionally removed from the rest of the cast during breaks, deliberately cultivating the isolation that defined Holliday's personality. Several actors later admitted that spending extended time near Kilmer during production created a genuinely unsettling feeling, because the boundary between the person and the performance had become almost invisible. That commitment produced something that pure technique alone could never have manufactured. The haunting quality of Kilmer's Doc Holliday does not come from clever choices made in the moment. It comes from weeks of sustained immersion in someone else's dying body and fading spirit. Among all the memorable moments Kilmer created during filming, one piece of dialogue took on a life nobody had anticipated. The words themselves existed in the original screenplay. They were not improvised or discovered accidentally. But something happened in the space between the page and Kilmer's delivery that transformed a functional line into one of the most quoted phrases in Western film history. The way he slowed the moment down, loaded it with a kind of comfortable menace, and let the silence around the words do as much work as the words themselves turned what could have been a throwaway line into something that stopped everyone on set when it was filmed. People working behind the cameras reportedly exchanged looks the moment it happened, recognizing that something had just been captured that could not be planned or repeated. That single delivery helped establish the entire emotional register of Doc Holliday as a character, a man so comfortable with danger that he could make a death threat sound almost like an invitation. One of the most distinctive scenes in Tombstone places Doc Holliday and Johnny Ringo in a verbal confrontation conducted entirely in Latin, a sequence that could easily have felt like a gimmick but instead became one of the film's most memorable exchanges. The authenticity of that scene did not happen by accident. Kilmer reportedly invested real time researching the Latin language as it would have been used and understood in the educated circles of the 19th century, working with people who understood both the historical context and the linguistic nuances involved. The result was a scene where intellectual superiority became its own form of violence. Holliday defeats Ringo with knowledge before either man reaches for a weapon, establishing a hierarchy between them that makes everything that follows feel inevitable. It is one of the clearest examples in the film of how carefully constructed details could elevate a moment far beyond its surface appearance. If the psychological pressures of production were not enough, the physical conditions of filming in Arizona added another layer of genuine suffering to the experience. The production's commitment to period-accurate costuming meant that actors spent long days under blazing desert sun wearing thick wool garments designed for 19th-century winters, not 20th-century film sets. Temperatures on location reportedly pushed toward extremes that would challenge even lightly dressed individuals, and the cast was wearing everything from heavy coats to multiple layers of period-appropriate undergarments. Reports of dizziness were common. Some actors reportedly lost consciousness during particularly grueling outdoor sequences. Val Kilmer later described the experience with dry humor, noting that simply surviving in the wardrobe had become its own form of preparation for the role. Sam Elliott was more direct, calling the shoot the most physically demanding experience of his professional life. The heat was not a minor in Convin. Among all the cast members pushed to their limits by Arizona's heat, Michael Biehn's experience during one particular sequence crossed from discomfort into something genuinely alarming. The climactic confrontation between Doc Holliday and Johnny Ringo required Bienh to perform in full black Western attire under conditions that had already depleted his physical reserves over the course of a long shooting day. By the time cameras rolled on the duel itself, dehydration had compromised his balance and affected his vision. The expression audiences read as menacing psychological breakdown from a man facing his end was not entirely a performance choice. Parts of it reflected the actual physical state Bienh was in, a man working hard to remain upright and present while his body communicated clearly that it was done for the day. That accidental authenticity embedded itself in the film in a way that no amount of deliberate acting could have replicated. Johnny Ringo looks genuinely unwell in that scene because the actor playing him genuinely was. The sequence that most audiences would identify as the film's centerpiece, the legendary gunfight that has been analyzed and celebrated for decades, did not unfold anywhere near as cleanly as it appears on screen. The production required multiple days of filming to capture all the elements needed for a sequence that lasts only minutes in the finished film. Dozens of individual camera setups were required. Carefully coordinated explosions had to be timed precisely alongside dialogue delivered in the middle of controlled chaos. Actors walked away from the experience with bruises from equipment and props. The noise levels generated by continuous gunfire and explosive effects pushed crew members to their limits, and reports suggested that by the final days of that particular sequence, some members of the technical crew had simply stopped monitoring the footage and were focusing entirely on getting through each take. The result on screen is a sequence that crackles with authentic energy, partly because the people creating it were operating on nerves and exhaustion by the time it was complete. Sam Elliott had come to Tombstone because something in the original script resonated with him deeply. The version of Virgil Earp that Jar had written was a man of quiet substance, someone whose emotional complexity and moral authority gave the story an important counterbalance to its more explosive elements. As production lurched through its various crises, rewriting scenes overnight and restructuring storylines on the fly, Elliott watched that. While Tombstone was struggling through its production troubles, a much larger, more powerful project was taking shape elsewhere in Hollywood. Kevin Costner was developing his own major Wyatt Earp film with the full backing and resources of a major studio behind it. Costner's project was positioned as the definitive cinematic treatment of the story, serious in tone, expansive in scope, and backed by the kind of marketing infrastructure that independent productions simply cannot match. Reports suggested that Costner was aware of Tombstone and actively worked to discourage studios and distributors from lending it support, preferring to face the audience without competition from another Wyatt Earp story arriving around the same time. For a smaller production already navigating financial uncertainty, that kind of industry-level pressure could have been fatal. Instead, it became irrelevant. When audiences finally saw both films, the heavily promoted, studio-backed version earned critical respect but struggled to connect emotionally. Tombstone, the underdog production that almost fell apart before it started, generated a passionate response that has never really stopped. Even the film's musical score arrived through a crisis. The original composer attached to the project departed during production, leaving the film without music at a stage when a replacement would normally have months to develop and record a full soundtrack. Bruce Broughton was brought in to fill that gap with almost no runway. The amount of time he was given to compose, arrange, record, and deliver a complete score for a major motion picture was a fraction of what the process typically requires. Working under that kind of pressure, he made instinctive decisions that turned out to be exactly right for the material. The themes he built for Doc Holliday carried a melancholy beauty that perfectly matched Kilmer's performance. The music underlying Wyatt Earp's quieter moments communicated a specific kind of controlled anger that words alone could not have conveyed. Broughton delivered work under impossible conditions that became one of the most well-regarded Western scores of its decade. When the film was first assembled from its troubled footage, the version that emerged lacked something essential. The original cut ended with Wyatt Earp simply riding away, disappearing into an open landscape without any moment of emotional resolution or reflection. There was no farewell. There was no acknowledgement of what had been lost or what had been survived. Early audiences who saw test screenings responded with confusion and a feeling of incompleteness, as if the story had simply stopped rather than ended. Their reaction was unmistakable and consistent enough that the production made the unusual decision to return to filming after the main shoot had concluded. The hospital farewell between Wyatt and Doc, and the quietly beautiful snow-covered epilogue that closes the film, were created specifically in response to what those test audiences communicated. Those scenes, which now feel like the emotional heart of the entire film, did not exist in Kevin Jarre's original script. They exist because audiences told the filmmakers that the story was not finished. Josephine Marcus could have been a decorative presence in Tombstone, the kind of love interest Western films had been placing beside their heroes for decades without much thought or development. Dana Delaney had other ideas. When she approached the audition, she deliberately moved away from the softer, more traditionally glamorous interpretation that the production seemed to be seeking and focused instead on projecting the independence, confidence, and genuine personality that the historical Josephine Marcus had apparently possessed in abundance. She had done real research into who Josephine was, and what she found was a woman who did not fit the passive archetype the Western genre typically assigned to women in supporting roles. Delaney carried that research into her performance and her advocacy for how the character should be written, pushing back against interpretations that would have reduced Josephine to a supporting player defined entirely by her relationship to Wyatt. The result was a character who actually occupies space in the film rather than simply filling it. One of the sequences in Tombstone that audiences frequently assume must be cinematic exaggeration turns out to have a genuine historical basis. The image of Wyatt Earp walking through gunfire without flinching, absorbing the chaos around him and responding with a single devastating shot, draws directly from accounts of a real incident in 1882. Historical records describe the actual Wyatt Earp advancing toward an armed opponent during an active firefight, surviving the initial volley of shots fired at him, and responding with the kind of calm, precise violence that had defined his reputation. Historians continue to debate specific details of what happened that day, as they do with most events from that era, but the essential drama of the scene did not originate in a screenwriter's imagination. The Old West genuinely produced moments that sound invented, and Tombstone had the wisdom to recognize which ones were worth preserving on film. Even as filming was underway, the production found itself facing resistance from an unexpected direction. Residents and historians connected to Tombstone, Arizona, the actual town where these events took place, had serious objections to how their history was being handled. Letters were sent to the production team. Some voices called for specific changes. A few went further, demanding that filming be halted entirely until their concerns were addressed. Their central argument was that Hollywood was taking real history, real people, and a real community's identity and reshaping them into something more convenient for dramatic purposes than accurate ones. The tension between historical responsibility and creative storytelling is not unique to Tombstone, but the proximity of the actual community to the filming location made the conflict unusually direct and personal. In the end, the film was completed as the